It's alive!
I'm just gonna jump straight into it basically. My aim for this project was to create some sort of set scenic design type products that I could present in some way. I ended up going down the Frankenstein route mainly just because I saw the book on my shelf and I was like, I've never read this book before. I don't know anything about it apart from Universal Studios character design. So I just thought I'd explore it, and this is the result of that. Though my main focus for this project was on the book and the 1931 James Whale Frankenstein, I did look into other Frankenstein inspired or adjacent medias, such as The Munsters, which was a sitcom in the 1960s. I also looked at some original illustrations from theatrical performances that took place when the book was first released, which was very cool, as well as the Rocky Horror Picture Show from 1975 and more recently Lisa Frankenstein, which gave off kind of the same comedic feel that Young Frankenstein in 1974 did, which was, I really like the comedic spin offs of this story. Apart from films and theatrical performances, including the Bradfordian Dramatic Society Frankenstein, which was really good, I also looked at different types of artistic scenery, especially what's done in like stop motion, which was I looked into Mary Shelley's Frankenhole. That was a stop motion series from 2010 to 17, and also immersive experiences like the House of Frankenstein in Bath. I want to specify that when I say looked at, it was mainly just the visual look of those films and medias that I took inspiration from. Most of my energy went into analyzing the 1931 script and reading through the book, so those are my main inspirations. I went into the script mainly looking at the shape of things visually. What stood out to me was the use of sharp angles and contrast between darker objects in the foreground and a more ghostly sky in the background to create a sense of foreboding. A part of the script uses the setting of an astronomical observatory to describe the space of Frankenstein's laboratory. This then got me thinking about planetariums and the idea of projected image onto a space. That idea also got me thinking about reflections, especially because in The Bride of Frankenstein, the monster looks at his reflection for the first time and kind of brushes his hand over the water because he doesn't want to see that. That then got me along the line of thinking of distorted imagery, specifically anamorphic art, which is described as imagery that is seen as distorted from one angle but normal from another. Specifically, the concept of a curved reflective surface stood out to me because of its relevance to the story. Because I don't own a curved mirror of any sort, I decided to go down the polished tinfoil route, which I knew would not work and I did not have the time for. So I just attempted to somehow see if I could in any way make tinfoil more reflective than it is by rubbing another kind of scrunched up ball of tinfoil against it, also ironing it. I didn't have much hope for these, but it was worth a try. It did not work. So I started thinking about shadows instead because an important part of the atmosphere is created by shadows, specifically in the film, that stretch across these large rooms that make up Dr. Waldman's classroom and Frankenstein's laboratory. To experiment, I created a curved surface with a piece of paper and strings extended between the two opposite sides of it, and created a flower stencil that I could shine from under onto the piece of paper. At first, this flower design didn't really mean anything to me, but later on, it is something that I decided to stick with because of how it plays into the story. This is when I start thinking about what exactly I want the a reflection to reflect onto. And I took the direction of creating a mountain scene that had a valley running around it and also in the shape of an amphitheater because of how descriptive Mary Shelley is of the environment in the books and the almost parallel feeling that nature is a powerful force on its own, just as the monster becomes a powerful force that Frankenstein can't control. I use the visual shape of mountains in Switzerland to really give off that feeling of looking at something that goes on forever. To create a draft of what I wanted the end product to look like, I cut out a silhouette of a mountain in those kind of shapes. I covered the mountain in tinfoil and used the stencil attached to a cardboard box as a kind of supporting structure to shine the light through onto it. I found that using a phone light created a lot sharper lines than just using a torch. With the design set, I started creating the official composition of mountains and arranged them in a way I liked, and created doubles because I wanted there to be a tinfoil outer wall and a textured inner wall. I wanted to create those separately so that they didn't interfere with each other during the process, and also adds more structure to the final outcome. To also hold the curve of the card, I created a wooden structure drying rack thing that I drilled holes into based on the angle of the curve of each piece and thread skewer through them so that they'd sit nicely on that while drying. I paper mache'd the backs of them so they would hold their shape there, and started creating a PVA paper mulch that would go on the inner walls to create that texture. I wanted to include some kind of attachment in between the mountains, and I used the visual of stitches and also that one toy you see in the doctor's office all the time, because a large part of the story includes the monster learning about the world and struggling with the way people view him. I think that feeling is really relevant to the experience of growing up, and mixing that visual with the concept of the stitches that I use to hold the monster's limbs together. I think it really fits in with the idea of the mountains also being a metaphor for the monster himself, because those bended rods with the beads on it join together the two sections of mountain. To figure out how I could do this, I experimented with setting some piece of string in PVA and placing them in various positions around some wooden skewers that were also covered in Vaseline to stop these strings sticking to them. I tried wrapping tissue paper around some, which created a more interesting texture and made the finished product more stable. I also attempted to make some beads out of tinfoil by wrapping it around a skewer, which didn't really turn out nice, so I'm glad I found some wooden beads instead that I could paint. This is when I started thinking about some more ornamental details, especially concerning the colour and patterns I wanted to include specifically for the stencil. I looked into some traditional Swiss folk art, which includes a lot of painting on furniture and objects around the house in these very smooth and effortless brushstrokes that normally depict flowers or plants or scenes of nature. Because the book is based in Switzerland, I thought it was important to explore some culturally relevant art that I could reference in the design. So I used these kind of shapes to create a stencil of flowers that have been specifically mentioned in the 1931 script, especially concerning the scene where Frankenstein throws the little girl into the water because he runs out of flowers to throw. As I start to piece together the composition, I do kind of notice where I might need to add an extra piece. So I do that, and I did unfortunately stick down the unpainted inner wall to the tinfoil wall because I was kind of in a rush to finish. But I realised as I'm painting later on that this runs the risk of getting paint on the tinfoil side, which isn't the worst thing in the world because when it's dry, I can scrape it off with little to no damage, but I do peel them away from each other in the end and paint them separately just to make that process easier. This is when I start painting the rods as well, and I am doing everything grey because I want to create that kind of black and white film feeling. Once I finish cutting the stencil and painting it, I do experiment with how I can present it in different ways. So I wrap fabric around it and I check to see if that would disturb the light in any way shining through, and it didn't. But I didn't end up liking this design because it looked a bit too messy. So I tried it out with just a plain piece of fabric over top instead, which did create some interesting wave patterns. I did, however, want it to be detachable and not an option I had to absolutely stick with because I wanted to keep the option of seeing the design underneath. But I did cut out and glue down the edges of a piece of fabric that I could potentially put over it. I then start to create more of a foundation for the outcome to rest on. So I drew around where the stencil had to be shown through and cut around this on a piece of cardboard that was big enough to hold everything and glued down the two boards I had onto this to keep it level. I add mulch to the floor of the valley, and this time I'm using mulch made out of newspaper, which already adds a grey undertone. So if I need that for anything in the future, I'll definitely go with that instead of just plain paper mulch to already get some of that colour coming through. I also used it to cover up the tabs I had used to position the mountains in place. Everything started coming together at this point, and I put the beads on the rods and pinned them in place at different positions in the center, just playing around with how it looked and where I wanted things to go. I do end up painting the center stencil a lighter greyish blue, and in combination with the fibers from the newspaper that have been set in place, it left this frosty kind of coating, which fit in with the storyline where Frankenstein is chasing the monster across the ice. Once I was happy with the positioning of everything, I layered mulch over the specific points at which the rods met the walls of the mountains. I was a bit worried what would happen if I put the mulch over the pins, but later on, when everything's dry and I take them out, they come out smoothly and fine, so that was great. At this point, I do go in and paint any missed spaces grey. In the final stretch of things, I wanted to construct a kind of cavernous fabric area around the mountains to make it look like the clouds were coming up near it. So I layered boxes and scrunched up pieces of paper behind to create some dimension. I also put a mirror behind there as well to make the space really feel cavernous. At this point, it's practically done, and I spend the rest of the time figuring out how I can capture different angles and use the lights in interesting ways. So, yeah. All in all, I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I did enjoy making it. I do also want to mention some other concepts I would have gone with if I hadn't gone with this, and that would be taking inspiration from Lisa Frankenstein and the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I thought about creating a book of sorts that had pages stood up with holes going through, and basing it off of the notes Frankenstein made about the monster in the book. And another one was creating kind of stained glass floating ice sheets out of transparent acrylic sheets. But I'm happy I went with the idea I did. If I had had more time and resources, I would have probably made the rods out of clay, which would have also given me more control over the texture. I would have also probably used a laser cutter to cut the stencil out, because the board that I used came apart very easily and started fraying when I cut into it. Apart from that, I'm really glad how it came out, and yeah, I don't really have anything left to say about it. It was great. I did it, and the end.
Now listen to me very carefully. Don't put the candle back.